All right, well, good morning. Good to see everybody here this early at SACS. I've got a lot to cover, so I'm going to launch right into it. 2023 to 24 is a period where the changing of the guard is underway. And what I'm referring to, changing two spheres, corporate leadership and sector leadership. Where are we leaving? Well, we're saying goodbye to Biogen as a central hub of neuroscience drug development. Now that meant a lot for a number of years. Their upfront payments for partnering exceeded everyone else combined for 7 years. But it's already evaporated. The last 3 years, compared to the 3 years previous, down 97%. Now, other companies have raised their partnership upfronts by 14%, but still, that's a chunk of support that's now missing. And just to note, from the Endpoints interview, Viehbacher says Biogen was never really a neuroscience company, which is the second most egregious form of denialism that I've heard since 2020. You're going to replace Biogen. It's not going to be one company. It will be several. But I think we all saw in December the advent of this changing the guard with the two major partner acquisitions, AbbVie and BMS. I think BMS is particularly interesting in that they had departed from neuroscience entirely when they bought Celgene, but they had stayed out of psychiatry for close to a decade, and then they jumped back in full force. A few other companies that also could take leadership roles, Neurocrine, while it's smaller scale, is still adopting a model where external, internal innovation are balanced into a number of partnerships. Numor, still earlier in the development, is also portfolio building. In terms of other potential leaders with a comprehensive portfolio, J&J and Lundbeck potentially could participate, but I think that would require some change in their corporate cultures. What's the biomarker for change? And I'm referring here to the change in sector leadership. I show this slide every year. It's actually less useful this year than usual. It shows in 2023, there was a slight decrease in investor funding, something of an increase in partnership funding, but that was in comparison to 2022, which was the worst year in a decade. Investors, the biggest cohort was in psychiatry. They've been sort of on the leading edge compared to their pharma counterparts. And I would note, I'm going to come into this later, pain, 3%. Partnering up fronts. Now, large companies want one thing from small companies, or have wanted one thing, and that's neurodegeneration disease modifiers. That's 86%. But this is deceptive because this kind of counts partnerships, but not acquisitions. So we all saw in December, 22.7 billion in CNS acquisitions. The majority, 61% for 2023 was in psychiatry. You see on the right, these are the combination partnership and acquisition upfront payments. And you can see the increase going to CNS. And 61% in 2023 for psychiatry, 1% in 2022. Why is this happening? Well, psychiatry can point to some landmark events, some tangible achievements. Karuna with a novel antipsychotic using a long, alluring but frustrating mechanism. MAPS, which is now Lykos Therapeutics, an effective treatment for PTSD, they will be approved. Sage and Biogen, an effective treatment for postpartum depression, and a number of other antidepressant mechanisms that have showed some promise. We should joke that psychiatrists from the 1970s could beam aboard a current clinic and feel fairly at home pretty soon. The names have changed, but the concepts and categories have not changed much. That's going to be different in 2 to 4 years. Starting with depression, we're going to be subdividing the depression population in a meaningful way that has not been done before. phenotypic subgrouping like anhedonia, the subgrouping of postpartum depression based on partially hormonal changes. Biomarkers like AI-driven EEG algorithms, Alto's using them. There's a company named Newmarker, which has an interesting EEG technology that they have some interesting data for. And a bunch of novel mechanisms. Some will work, some won't, but kappa opioid antagonists, potassium channel modulators, glutamatergic, neurotrophic, a raft of psychedelic companies, which I'll talk about later, and psychoplastogens who take the hallucinations out of psychedelics. And some other novel mechanisms, thyroid receptor beta agonism, for example, vasopressin 1b antagonism. Again, there's a lot of creativity going into an area that at one point was seen as moribund. Now, one high-profile event during 2023 was zuranolone's mixed reception at the FDA, where they rejected it for MDD, but approved for PPD. Now, the data set for MDD was funky. I thought there was a justification for considering it as a possible 2-week treatment alternative for people that I would call treatment-reluctant depression. But the FDA kept its standards reasonably high there. But it's more important that it was approved for PPD from a clinical point of view. It's much more urgent, undertreated. There is room for premium pricing that would have not been there for MDD. So I think there is a silver lining to be had from the FDA's decision. Schizophrenia, Karuna's KarXT, a new muscarinic treatment paradigm. Cerevel, Neurocrine, Neumora. I should note that Neurocrine emailed me 30 minutes after I sent out my most recent issue saying ours aren't PAMs, they're orthosteric. So, sorry. Sumitomo with Sanofi's Dilogerant. TAR1 agonism has had a mixed reception at best. Roche's compound failed. Merck is trying to change the course of PD-10 inhibition, but they'll have results this year. And Reviva had an impressive phase 3 that nobody cared about because it looked like, on shorthand, another serotonergic, dopaminergic antidepressant. How to impact cognitive impairment in schizophrenia? Multiple M1 PAMs and orthosteric modulators will be tried. Boehringer has a massive GlyT inhibitor program that'll finish next year. Neurocrine's levodoxastat data coming out this year. Cognify have their drug with results coming. And Kinexus is a new company. They've taken up a Mitsubishi-developed CAT2 inhibitor that should tap into the kynurenine mechanism, one that was getting a lot of attention a few years ago and then seemed to have receded. But they've gone into phase 1 and they've raised $63 million. Now to neurology, which used to be the paramount sector and now it's not. It's an underwhelming start, and I would consider it more of a dress rehearsal. Leqembi's A-size program, particularly compared to Aduhelm's, was well executed. The FDA followed its own rules. It's a first step. Donanemab will eventually be launched as well. But the MCID, the minimal clinically important difference for the cognitive measures used for either of those drugs, falls well short of anything that's visible. So they're relying upon barely palpable shifts in disease progression rate. The benefits are harder to quantify than the risks. I've been told by one KO to expect a real-world fatality rate of 0.5 to 1%. Now the uptake of Leqembi has been slow, $2 million worth in third quarter. So some of these projections may be unrealistically optimistic. But if 1 million patients end up taking one of these MABs, one can expect 5,000 to 10,000 deaths. It's not insignificant. So the New York Times interviewed a donanemab patient spouse, and this is what she said. I don't know if the drug has helped him or not, I can't tell. That's going to be the modal impression. People aren't going to be sure whether anything's happening. So I've devised an advertising campaign. What it lacks in power, it makes up for in truthfulness. Other Alzheimer's mechanisms. I mean, as we all know, tau MABs have largely been failures. But Janssen and AC Immune have an active vaccine that's gone into phase 2B. Lilly has an OGK inhibitor that should affect tau phosphorylation, phase 2 data this year. And there are a couple ASOs and gene therapy programs that have some interesting early biomarker stats, but it's very early on. Neuroinflammation is a midstream mechanism that's getting a lot of attention. And we'll see the first phase 2 POC results for a TREM2 drug from AbbVie and Elector towards the end of this year. There's also a number of companies involved in protein degradation and clearance. And the infection paradigm continues. Cortex-Zyme has been resurrected as Lighthouse, and Keystone Bio is pursuing peach and gingivitis as well. They're presenting today. In terms of the rest of neurology, target specificity was not the panacea we've been hoping for. We thought if we could identify the genetic linkages contributing to a disorder, that would ease the task of developing and identifying effective drugs. That worked in SMA, but so far, Huntington's has not panned out very well as a target. Either tominersen made patients worse, Wave's ASOs didn't work so far. uniQure had confusing data, but hope springs eternal. Novartis just paid significant money to Voyager for a new generation of Huntington's and SMA capsids. One of the more intriguing genetically linked neurodegenerative disorders, frontotemporal dementia with a progranulin mutation. Elector and GSK paid a lot of money for a company that isn't in CNS allegedly to Elector to partner their sortilin MAB. Now they've reframed their phase 3. They don't expect results in 2026, but in fact, I'm sure there are interim analyses built in. Takeda and Denali have a drug in phase 1/2, and Arcuda as an oral small molecule in IND prep. Parkinson's, some of Biogen's cost-cutting impacted the LRRK2 program with Denali. They dropped the longer-term phase 3, and they're just going with one single, slightly expanded phase 2/3. GBA mutations, Lilly and Prevail in phase 1/2. Bial has an oral drug in phase 2. Neurocrine with Voyager and Nomura have GBA-linked PD programs as well. We've been waiting for 40 years to see if cell therapy can work in Parkinson's. Bayer with Blue Rock has some interesting phase 1B data. We'll see if it actually carries through clinically. Alpha-synuclein is the protein aggregate of interest in Parkinson's. And we'll have some phase 2B data this year from Roche and Prothena to show whether or not, in fact, it can be effectively addressed. ALS. Relyvrio has decent sales, but they flattened. It's kind of looking like Radicava. But the EU continues to say it's not effective enough, and they've refused approval. Sanofi and Denali have phase 2 data for RBK1 this year. With C9orf72 subtypes relevant to ALS and FTD, those ASOs have failed. An interesting thing that's happened with EIF2B inhibitors. We're actually going to have a head-to-head contest. AbbVie with Calico versus Denali. They're both in the Healy Center Consortium trial. We rarely get to see novel disease modifiers going against each other head-to-head. TDP-43, interesting target. Roche and Akina are involved there. Asalot, who is presenting today sometime, has a program. There are some alternate routes to TDP-43 normalization, taxane PIK5 and Stathmin-2. Stroke. I was naive enough to think that 2023 would be the year that stroke would once again be considered clinically and commercially viable, and it hasn't really panned out. Nanotherapeutics had neuronitide fail in a phase 3 where the standard ER triage was used. It was positive in a phase 3 where they had paramedics administer it, averaging in 1 hour after stroke onset. 30 to 40% less likelihood of long-term impairment. Biogen, again, a cost-cutting move. They had licensed a promising thrombolytic with a 12-hour treatment window compared to TPA's 4.5 hours. They announced a major phase 2, then they delayed it, and now they've dropped it entirely. So these are two programs that look like they actually would improve the standard of care. It's unclear if either of them will be funded. Epilepsy. Number of programs addressing severe pediatric epilepsies and treatment-resistant epilepsy, using a number of pathways. I would point out the one that's crossed out. Longboard actually reported the data for their 5-HT2C agonist. And in Dravet syndrome patients, it knocked down seizure frequency by 73%. So it may be a safer, effective version of Fintepla. Psychedelics. Sort of time for psychedelics to show what they can actually do. There was a blip of enthusiasm in 2021. Funding has gone down somewhat, although more established companies continue to get enough money to pursue their programs. Some consolidations underway. Lusaris had $60 million and disappeared. Don't know how much of the money went with it. Multiple micro companies have vaporized, many of them deservedly so. Otsuka acquired Mindset. They're the only large company that has taken an active involvement in psychedelic drug development. Cybin acquired Small Pharma, thus preventing a nasty IP dispute. Beckley acquired Eleusis, and I would note that Atai just bought 35.5% of Beckley, which filled a hole in Atai's portfolio. With psychedelics and pathogens, they have undeniably dynamic impact. MAPS, Lykos, MDMA, and PTSD. Cohen's d is 0.91, and keep in mind that when we look at successful psychiatry trials, we tend to see therapeutic effects in the 0.3 to 0.4 range. So this is quite striking. Cybin did a small phase 2, so this will not be replicated, but they had a Cohen's d of 2.15. I just like saying that once. MindMed's LSD and generalized anxiety disorder. I have serious questions about the commercial viability of that program, but without any psychological prep or integration work, a very minimalist approach, they had a Cohen's d of 0.88. Core question regarding psychedelics continues to be, are hallucinations a bug or a feature? Now, the ethos that generated the psychedelic movement was that intense change, some people would call it mystical, but certainly hallucinatory effects were necessary for genuine impact. And that's what most companies have pursued. But there is a significant cohort of scientifically credible companies who think it's the neuroplasticity afforded by 5-HT2A agonism. Delix, Oncero, Celera, Intracellular. Delix is the first one to go into phase 1, and they may actually have some phase 2 efficacy data maybe at the end of this year, but more likely early 2025, where they can show, in fact, whether neuroplasticity alone induces that kind of change. Other questions? What duration is necessary or viable? It seems to me that 10, 12 hours is viable only in addiction treatment formats. 6 hours for psilocybin is doable, but as Compass has found, it's challenging. Deuterated psilocybin, 4 hours, a number of programs with 2 to 3 hour duration. And you have the cohort that has very rapid acting effects, DMT and 5-MeO DMT. Is it sufficient? Is it too anxiogenic? You may know something about that from Beckley's phase 2B in depression, 5-MeO DMT, that will report out, I think, later this year. How many doses are needed? Cybin's latest data set points to the benefit of repetition. Psych-PrEP integration, how much is optimal? MAPS developed a very complex treatment regimen, so did Compass. Now the trend seems to be towards backing away from psychotherapy as an integral component of this treatment protocol. Essential, screening out those who are too fragile. And for anyone who wonders what an example of that is, that tragic, near tragic tale of the off-duty Alaska Airlines pilot shows you that some people should not be tried psychedelics. And there's always the possibility of regulatory backlash. There's no shortage of reactionary movements in this country and in the EU, and that could happen to psychedelics as well. Other interesting seen as data sets of 2025 that I haven't mentioned yet. Vertex, I don't mention pain very often because not very many people are pursuing it. Lilly has continued to have an active pain program. Merck has some in-house research, but the amount of investment in pain, you would think that pain has been solved, where obviously it has not. Vertex had positive phase 2b results in diabetic peripheral neuropathy. Vistagen is an inhalable neurosteroid that they're using for social anxiety with a public speaking paradigm. The interesting thing is that the FDA apparently is letting them use the same public speaking model in phase 3. Lundbeck had positive data for a PACAP inhibitor, another next generation migraine prophylactic, and Neuroscience had positive phase 2A results in PD-LID. A lot of important data sets coming in the next couple of years. Alzheimer's, I've mentioned a couple of these already. I would add Cognition Therapeutics should have phase 2 data this year. And Novo Nordisk next year will show whether or not their massive phase 3 program for semaglutide in Alzheimer's pays off. I don't think it will, but if it does, maybe we should give semaglutide for everything. Depression, mentioned most of these programs already. Cognition, already mentioned. MS, BTK inhibition was thought to be the next great multiple sclerosis disease modifier. So far, compounds have either failed due to safety issues, lack of efficacy, or both. Parkinson's, a number of symptomatic treatments that are going to have data soon, including AbbVie and Cerevel with tavapadon. Some readouts to watch in epilepsy. I mentioned longboards already. Takeda and Ovid with soticlestat, Xenon, J&J Addex, they've been waiting for many years for those results to finally come in. Rapport with an 8-gamma TARP inhibitor that they licensed from J&J. Schizophrenia, most of those have been mentioned. Tourette's. Amylex and Noema will have data this year for drugs treating stuttering. Angelman syndrome, which has been frustrating for some gene therapy companies. Acadia and Neuron should have phase 2 data. Huntington's, as I mentioned before, uniQure's data was very confusing on some biomarker readouts. It's also technically very complex. Point to the last one, addiction. We don't have many addiction programs ongoing, and that's a tragedy, as anyone who reads the papers knows. But there are 3 readouts that we should have this year or next year for addiction therapeutics, a neglected area. So next 5 years, I said changing the guard, well, there's going to be a transformation in neurotherapeutics. The easiest one is psychiatry, because you can see with slightly altered slide formatting. That's starting really late 2025, mid-2025, when KarXT gets fully underway. Improved symptomatic treatments. There'll be therapies for Alzheimer's psychosis and motoric deficits in Parkinson's that will come online probably a year and a half later. Disease modification for genetic neurodegeneration will come next. My guess, your guess is as good as mine about sporadic neurodegeneration and disease modifiers. In pain, I have a question mark because the question is, when will people start reinvesting in pain therapeutics? It's very much intertwined with addiction, but both are under resourced areas. And that's it.